Hello everyone. Today we're going to be doing a short pre-lecture for our readings this week. This is the first week where you're going to be expected to do a fair amount of independent reading and expected to come to the lecture with prior knowledge. So my expectation is that you will have read Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 from Knowledge, A Very Short Introduction by Jennifer Nagel before you watch our actual class lecture. And that's going to be apparent in the way I lecture. It's going to assume that you know what's said in here. Now, I wanted to give a few notes on how you should read this and give you a little bit of background about what's going to be discussed. So we're going to be reading chapters 1 and 2 from this book. This book is about epistemology, or the study of knowledge and truth. And this first chapter is just going to be an introduction to the general ideas of epistemology, while the second chapter is going to introduce us to one of the most profound challenges in epistemology throughout history, which is the challenge of skepticism, a challenge that we may not in fact know what we think we know, or anything at all. Luckily, this book is very clear, so most of what you're going to encounter is going to be relatively easy to understand. However, I do have a few notes about how to read this. The first thing is there's a fair amount of history in these first two chapters, and Nagel will in fact do a lot of sort of historical contextualizing as we move through. This is great and very useful information to learn if you're able to do so, but don't stress too much about that. This isn't a history of philosophy class, this is a philosophy class. So the most important information for you to gather while you read is going to be things like, well, what ideas are at stake here? What questions are being asked and how are they being answered? How would these different views relate to one another? What sort of evidence is relevant to these claims? That's what you should be focusing on. So focus on understanding what was said, not when it was said or who said it. Now, of course, that information is important, so it's worth picking up. But the primary focus is going to be on comprehending the material, less so than on being able to contextualize it in history. A very important skill in its own right, but not the focus of this course. Now, on the syllabus, I have stated that one of our assignments is going to be reading the first meditation from Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. I'm going to be making that, as well as all of our historical readings that I had intended to tag along from this point forward, optional. And this is because, due to these technical difficulties that I've been having, there's been a very slow progression on my end, and I've been consistently behind my own deadlines. And I don't think it's fair to ask you to do the same amount of work in less time. I mean, I had a little bit of wiggle room in there, but we have passed that wiggle room to the point that I'm going to need to start shaving the fluff off. Now, I still recommend you do read this, and I will still be introducing these topics and discussing them, but I'll assume less background about them than I normally would. Now, to contextualize Descartes, Descartes was a French philosopher who was active at the turn of the 16th to 17th century, so late 1500s, early 1600s, up to, I think, 1650 or so. And Descartes' project in the Meditations is primarily epistemological. That is, he's trying to determine a way for us to understand understanding. He's trying to develop a framework in which we can understand knowledge more effectively. And the way he does this, and the reason it's going to be relevant to our chapters this week, is that he builds his epistemology in response to a skeptic argument. That is, he uses skepticism as the motivating question of epistemology. The very first thing we have to do is answer the skeptic. One thing you'll see as you read your text, in the Knowledge, A Very Short Introduction, particularly Chapter 2, is that there's some debate about this idea. But Descartes kicked off a sort of popular theme in epistemology, that the first place you have to start is responding to the skeptic. Whether or not that was a productive move, or whether it slowed us down, is something we'll be discussing in our discussion sections. Luckily, Descartes' writings, despite the fact that they were written in Latin a couple hundred years ago, actually translate pretty clearly into English. Particularly the first Meditations, which is very short. It's only a couple of pages long, I think 5 or so. And you'll be able to move through that very quickly if you choose to do so. So I do highly recommend at least reading that. The second meditation is where he gets into some more substantive work. If you're really interested in seeing how these ideas play out, it's definitely worth reading. It's also pretty short, but it does get more technical. Luckily, the first couple of pages is really all you need to do to get an idea of where he's going to go. But it's definitely worth reading. I'm going to be posting the entire meditations, which even taken as a whole are relatively short. Don't feel the need to read through all of them, but if you are interested, it is certainly worth looking at. It's a worthwhile read. I will warn you that it gets more technical as you move through, and he's going to start using special language and idioms that were appropriate in the context that he was writing, that is, as a scholar writing to other scholars, particularly a Catholic scholar writing to other Catholic scholars at that time period. He uses turns of phrases and assumptions that would be familiar to his colleagues that may not be familiar to us. This isn't going to be a problem for the first meditations or even really the second meditations, but once you get past that, you'll start seeing that a lot if you decide to look that far. So those are going to be our readings this week. Right. Chapter 1 and 2 from Knowledge, Very Short, and Introduction, which are very easy introductory sections that will give you a picture of epistemology and put it in the backdrop of skepticism, and then raise the sort of meta question about whether or not we should look at epistemology through the lens of skepticism primarily, or if there's a better way to do this. And then we're going to be looking, hopefully, if we have time, at some of what Descartes said. Remember, again, if you aren't able to complete Descartes' readings, don't kick yourself too much. You're missing out a little bit, but it really wasn't totally essential to what we were going to be talking about. It was just going to give you some more historical context, and we will discuss it as I lecture, post-reading lecture, give the full lecture in a couple of days. We are moving towards catching up, but there is still a lot of work to be done. I'm going to do my best to make sure that the process of catching up is not an undue burden to you. I know that already this has been somewhat the case, that you've had to deal with things that you should have had to deal with, and I apologize for that, and thank you for bearing with me. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the reading. It really shouldn't take too long, and it shouldn't be too difficult. If you have any questions or have any challenges, let me know. And what the weekly letters are going to be from now on are mostly going to be, I'll ask you a question about the reading, so something to think about. In this case, it's going to be, what do you think about the idea of having skepticism being the starting point of epistemology? That is, how relevant should we take the skeptic challenge to be to epistemology as properly practiced? And then we're going to also have a sort of question that's always going to be there is, and what questions do you have about the material that you want me to address? So that's our pre-lecture. I hope you enjoy the readings, and I will see you at our post-lecture.